For decades, the world hung on the brink of nuclear annihilation. And despite the certain total destruction promised by nuclear war, military planners in both the United States and the Soviet Union sought ways to come out ahead in a potential exchange. Some of these plans were based on completely unrealistic assumptions. Others might have had a chance of success in a real nuclear exchange. What was overwhelmingly certain, however, was that in nuclear war, losses on either side would be staggering. But just how did the US military plan on fighting a nuclear war? When you hear the term nuclear war, you probably think of an all-out exchange and the end of civilization. And this is certainly a likely outcome. Yet nuclear war isn't as cut and dry as a single full exchange scenario. And both the Soviet Union and the United States knew this. Nuclear weapons were extremely useful for both sides. For the United States, it offered a way to neutralize the Soviet Union's massive numbers advantage against it. For the Soviet Union, it was a way to neutralize the United States' technological edge. Both sides had plans for nuclear weapons and even a conventional war. And some local commanders on both sides even chafed at the need to seek higher authority than themselves to use nuclear weapons. President Eisenhower initially believed that nuclear weapons were no different than any other bomb or bullet the military used and saw no reason why they couldn't be used against dedicated military targets. However, as nuclear weapons grew in destructive potential and their use proliferated to the Soviet Union and other nations, he very quickly changed his mind. However, what did not change was the possibility of using them against strictly military targets. In Europe, the US military planned on using small tactical nuclear weapons against Soviet armor and infantry forces. While technologically superior and better trained, US and NATO forces were vastly outnumbered by the forces of the Soviet Union and its Soviet bloc allies. Both sides knew that tactical nuclear weapons were the only chance at stopping the Soviets from washing across Europe like a giant tide. For this purpose, battlefield commanders would briefly be authorized to launch limited nuclear attacks using small and low-yield weapons, but only against dedicated military targets. Attacks on military targets close to population or industrial centers were strictly forbidden, as it was hoped that attacking only military targets deployed in the field would limit the possibility for escalation. If US nuclear attacks did not hit civilian or industrial centers, then the Soviets may respond with tactical nuclear strikes of their own, but not initiate a full response targeting American civilian and industrial sectors. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only way to secure victory against the Soviet Union. Today, nuclear war planning takes a similar and flexible approach, seeking to limit the possibility of unchecked escalation. While the United States currently has the conventional military power to defeat Russia or China without the need of nuclear weapons, should that balance of power change, we can envision how the US would respond to a nuclear war. Today, the US maintains a very small inventory of tactical nuclear weapons, and these weapons can only be delivered via military aircraft, a far cry from systems such as the man-portable Davy Crockett tactical weapon, which could be fired by a group of 3 men at columns of Soviet tanks. In a fictional scenario where Russia or China achieved numerological and technological parity with the US, and war broke out, these low-yield tactical nuclear weapons would make up the first salvo of a nuclear war. With approximately 500 B-61 gravity bombs, the United States would quickly begin arming F-16s and F-35s with these variable-yield weapons. Initially, they would be launched against enemy positions, hitting large concentrations of troops and, much like in the Cold War, avoiding striking at civilian or industrial centers. One major problem with the Cold War-era planning was that despite Soviet military targets being the initial focus in a nuclear exchange, launching an attack against these targets without complete and total surprise would take so long that most of the equipment and personnel at these sites would have been evacuated. Some mission-critical hardware and structures that could not be physically moved would be destroyed, and the site rendered inoperable for several weeks, but most of the actual military targets the US was looking to destroy would avoid the attack by simply dispersing. Today, dispersion is less of a concern thanks to greatly improved surveillance and attack capabilities that the Cold War US could only have dreamt of. Advanced reconnaissance satellites can easily pinpoint the movement of enemy troops and hardware, and global communications afforded by satellite links can easily connect pilots on strike missions with the intelligence needed to hit the right targets. Thus, in a modern scenario, American F-16s and F-35s would immediately be launched in attacks against enemy troop formations. It would be expected that the enemy would retaliate in kind, and it's even hoped so. After all, if enemy forces retaliated with similar tactical nuclear strikes, they might feel satisfied and not need to escalate an exchange. To limit their own losses, American units would widely disperse, while other U.S. assets sought to interfere with or destroy the complex communications and intelligence chains of assets required for accurate targeting. The next level of nuclear escalation would come if the U.S. believed that a greater expansion was inevitable, or if enemy forces began the escalation themselves. The United States would next move to attack more strategic rather than tactical targets, striking out enemy military installations and communications hubs. These attacks may still be carried out with airborne assets, but other than the B-2 stealth bomber, it's not likely any American aircraft would survive long enough to deliver the bombs to assigned targets deeper in enemy-held territory. Instead, the United States would need to either use submarine-launched ballistic missiles or SLBMs or traditional ICBMs. Modern American weapons feature the ability to produce variable yields, scaling up or down their destructive potential. Future American nuclear weapons will even be able to scale their yields down as low as 2% of the bomb used on Hiroshima. This gives the U.S. options that would hopefully limit the expansion of a nuclear war. By using low-yield weapons against non-civilian or industrial targets, it's hoped that if any response was forthcoming, then that response would similarly target American military and communication targets with low-yield weapons and avoid industry and population centers. One certain target would be Russian or Chinese nuclear weapons, and this presents a problem for U.S. war planners. It's not believed that the SLBMs have the penetration power to permanently shut down any ICBM field, requiring the use of ICBMs for the job. American ICBMs, however, would themselves be immediately targeted by enemy ICBMs unless the American attack was a bolt out of the blue, which achieved complete surprise. With submarine-based weapons lacking the penetration power of ICBMs, and American ICBM fields in the U.S. being immediately counterattacked by enemy nuclear strikes, this means that the U.S. faces a conundrum. While it wishes to limit the scope of the war, not using all of its available ICBM inventory at the start of a war means it will never get a chance to do so, as any unlaunched ICBMs will be destroyed by enemy counterattacks. It is the traditional use-it-or-lose-it scenario, and one that many fear means a limited escalation is all but impossible. If the U.S. chose to use ICBMs only to strike at military targets and enemy missile fields, and left those targeting major population and industrial centers for deterrence unlaunched, then they would be destroyed in the ensuing counterattack, and the U.S. would forever lose the ability to launch its most high-yield weapons. In this scenario, the United States would have given up nuclear parity and deterrence from escalation by holding cities under threat for the sake of striking a few military targets, losing nearly half of all of its nuclear capabilities, while using only a small fraction of them in return. Should any enemy nuclear missile fields remain operational after the attack, the U.S. would be at a severe disadvantage going forward. It's likely then that striking at only military targets is impossible, and the U.S. would simply opt for escalating one more rung up the ladder. This would involve adding enemy industrial and economic hubs to the list of approved targets for nuclear strike, with the aim of preventing attacks against population centers, but still destroying the enemy's ability to continue fighting. At this point in the nuclear war, targeting would have the dual purpose of not just stopping the enemy's ability to fight today, but ensuring that the enemy is far too damaged economically or politically to rebuild faster than the United States in the post-war period. For U.S. nuclear war planning, considerations on the U.S. achieving superiority in the post-war period are given highest priority. The next step in the nuclear war ladder is an all-out exchange, with the targeting of major population centers. This is in fact not an active war plan of the United States, meaning that a massive attack against enemy cities is not actually planned for as part of any war planning. Rather, a massive all-out exchange would be the casualty of an increasingly escalating nuclear war. The ability to target and destroy cities is held only as a deterrent, hopefully convincing the enemy that escalating past the previous rung on the nuclear ladder is simply not worth it. If, however, an initial attack was detected or even just feared, the U.S. may simply opt to attack first. As part of its commitment to safeguard allies under its nuclear umbrella, the United States retains a nuclear first strike policy to this day. As nuclear war escalates, a select portion of the American military and nuclear assets would immediately go into reserve in sheltered locations. U.S. war planning dictates that a strategic reserve of both nuclear weapons and conventional forces be established during a nuclear conflict, so that in the post-war period the United States still has access to some level of conventional military power as well as nuclear weapons for defense. Even in a post-nuclear war involving an all-out exchange and the destruction of most major cities around the world, the same nuclear weapons that brought about the end of the world would remain ready to launch a new apocalyptic war for whoever survives.